In January of 1923, children in a small town 9 miles east of Cedar Key on the Gulf Coast of Florida still walked to school every morning past the sugarcane press. Their parents owned their land. Their 2 churches held services loud enough to hear from the road. By the end of that same month, the school was ash. The churches were ash. Every home in the town had been burned to the ground by a mob of white men from surrounding counties, and the families who had lived there for more than 40 years were gone. For the next 6 decades, almost no one said a word about what happened. What took place in Rosewood was not a riot. It was a planned erasure. And it began with a lie told on New Year's morning, 1923, in the next town over. Rosewood sat in the flat woods of Levy County, a stretch of Gulf Coast Florida where the land was more water than soil, and the cedar trees grew thick enough to turn afternoon into dusk. Mosquitoes bred in the standing water, alligators moved through the cypress swamps that bordered the settlement on 3 sides. It was not easy country, and that was part of the point. After the Civil War, formerly enslaved families settled along the tracks of the Seaboard Airline Railroad, which cut through the flatwoods on its route between Gainesville and Cedar Key. They cleared plots in the palmetto scrub, raised houses from local timber, and planted gardens in the sandy ground. The railroad made it possible to ship goods and receive supplies. By the 1870s, a community had taken root in a place that offered black families something rare in post-war Florida: distance from the nearest white authority. The pencil industry brought the first reliable wages. Red cedar, the wood used to encase graphite in writing pencils, grew in dense stands throughout the surrounding forest, and the mills that processed it provided steady employment. In the early decades, both white and black families lived in Rosewood. But by the turn of the 20th century, the demographics had shifted. Most white residents had moved 1.5 miles east to Sumner, a company town organized around the Cummer Lumber Company's sawmill. Rosewood became a predominantly black community. A handful of white families stayed, including a storekeeper named John Wright, but the town's identity was clear. The 2 towns shared the railroad and a deeply unequal but functional economic relationship. Black workers from Rosewood walked to Sumner each morning for mill shifts. White merchants in Sumner sold goods to Rosewood families. The Cummer Company depended on labor from both and treated them as a single workforce. The arrangement followed the familiar arithmetic of the Jim Crow rural South. Black labor was essential, black proximity was tolerated, and black prosperity was observed with a wariness that had not yet found its provocation. By 1920, the federal census recorded Rosewood as a community of roughly 120 people, though oral histories placed the number closer to 200. It was not a wealthy town, but it was rooted. In that part of Florida, in that era, a rooted black community was not something that happened by default. It was something that had been built. What Rosewood had by the early 1920s was the architecture of self-sufficiency built from scratch over 2 generations. There were 2 churches, an African Methodist Episcopal church and a Baptist church, both raised by their own congregations from locally milled lumber, the frames assembled on consecutive Saturdays by men who spent their weekdays at the Cummer Mill. There was a Masonic hall where men gathered on Wednesday evenings. There was a 1-room school for black children, taught by a teacher who lived in the small house beside it. There was a sugarcane press and a turpentine still. Several families grew their own produce on their own plots: sweet potatoes, collard greens, sugarcane, peppers. The Carriers, the Bradleys, the Doctors, the Gordons, the Halls, the Kings, the Colemans, these were families who held legal title to their land. They were not sharecroppers. They were not tenants. They owned what they had built. Sarah Carrier was the matriarch of one of the largest families in town. She worked as a laundress for white families in Sumner, walking the 1.5 miles between the 2 towns with bundles of washed and pressed clothes. Her son Sylvester had served in the United States Army during the First World War and returned to Levy County after the armistice. He hunted in the surrounding woods. He fished the creeks that fed the cedar swamps. He was known as a marksman who could put a bullet through a target at distances most men would not bother to aim at. He was also known as a man who did not practice the rituals of submission that the Jim Crow South demanded of black men when white men were present. His mother's house, a two-story pine and cypress structure near the center of town, served as the gathering place for the extended Carrier family. It would become the most consequential building in the story of what happened to Rosewood. The children of the community played baseball against teams from other black towns in the region. They swam in a creek just past the tree line. On Saturday evenings, the Masonic Lodge held social events. On Sunday mornings, the two churches filled the clearing with hymns loud enough to hear from the road. This is what must be understood before the violence can be placed in its full context. Rosewood was not a scattering of shacks at the edge of a swamp. It was a community that had assembled its own institutions, on its own land, with its own labor, across more than 4 decades. The people who lived there expected to remain. What was about to be destroyed was not abstract. It was specific, documented, named, and built to last. Fannie Taylor was the wife of James Taylor, a mill foreman at the Cummer Sawmill in Sumner. On the morning of New Year's Day, 1923, her screams brought neighbors to her front door. She had bruises on her face. She was visibly shaken, and she told them that a black man had broken into her home and assaulted her. The accusation moved through Sumner in a matter of hours. It moved the way such accusations always traveled in the Jim Crow South, not as a claim requiring investigation, but as a settled fact demanding immediate punishment. By the afternoon, a group of white men had organized a hunting party. They borrowed bloodhounds from a convict labor camp in the area. The dogs picked up a scent heading toward the woods between Sumner and Rosewood. What Fannie Taylor did not tell her neighbors, and what several of them already suspected even that morning, was that her injuries had not been caused by a black stranger. A white man had been seen leaving her back door before the screams began. People in Sumner knew she had been involved with someone other than her husband. The bruises, according to testimony gathered decades later, had come from a dispute with her lover, not from an intruder's assault. There was no break-in. There was no attacker. There was a woman who needed an explanation for her injuries that would not reveal their actual cause. But the accuracy of Fannie Taylor's story carried no practical weight in Levy County in January of 1923. An accusation by a white woman against an unnamed black man activated a sequence that no retraction could interrupt and no evidence could redirect. The search party did not require proof. It required a direction. The bloodhounds provided one. The name attached to the alleged assailant was Jesse Hunter, a black man who had recently escaped from a road gang in the area. No documented evidence connected Jesse Hunter to Fannie Taylor's house or to Sumner on the morning in question. Hunter was never found, never arrested, never brought before a judge. But his name gave the mob a justification it could carry into the woods, and the scent trail led toward Rosewood. The first person to die was not Jesse Hunter. His name was Sam Carter. Carter was a black man who lived at the edge of Rosewood. On the evening of January 1st, the mob arrived at his door. They accused him of helping Jesse Hunter escape into the cypress swamps west of town. Whether Sam Carter had ever encountered Jesse Hunter, whether he possessed any knowledge of the man's whereabouts, whether he had committed any act at all beyond living in a place the mob had decided to search were questions no one present showed interest in answering. They took Carter into the woods at gunpoint and ordered him to lead them to where Hunter was hiding. Carter walked them through the swamp, through standing water and dense saw palmetto, pointing at locations that held nothing. There was nothing to find. Jesse Hunter, if he had been in the area at all, was gone. But the mob had not assembled itself to return empty-handed. When the men concluded that Carter was leading them nowhere, they stopped. What happened next was described by participants decades later when journalists came asking questions that no one had asked in 1923. Sam Carter was bound to a tree. He was tortured. He was killed. His body was left hanging in the cypress woods, punctured by gunfire, as a message to every black person in the area. No one from Rosewood attempted to recover the body. No one had the power to try. The killing of Sam Carter did not end the violence. It multiplied it. Over the following 2 days, the mob expanded. Men arrived from neighboring counties, from towns 20 and 30 miles away, from communities with no connection to Fannie Taylor or Sumner or any event that had taken place there. Some brought their own weapons. Some brought whiskey. Sheriff Robert Elias Walker of Levy County was informed of the growing mob. He was aware of its size. He was aware of its direction. He took no action to stop it. By the evening of January 4th, the mob numbered several hundred armed men, and they turned toward the 2-story house at the center of Rosewood where Sarah Carrier and her family waited inside. Sarah Carrier's house was a 2-story structure built from pine and cypress, standing near the center of Rosewood. On the evening of January 4th, 1923, it was the most crowded building in the settlement. Sarah was inside. Sylvester was inside. And gathered through the rooms and along the upstairs hallway were women, children, and elderly residents from neighboring homes who had come to the Carrier house because they believed it was the safest place remaining in Rosewood. Sylvester Carrier was there, and Sylvester had weapons. He had served in the United States Army during the First World War. He had been trained in the use of firearms, and he had returned to Levy County as a man who had experienced a world beyond the Flatwoods and its customs. On the evening of January 4th, as the mob assembled in the darkness outside his mother's house, Sylvester made a decision that would determine the fate of every person in the town. He would not allow the men outside to take the people sheltering inside. The mob arrived after nightfall. The sequence of what happened has been reconstructed from witness testimony gathered decades later, pieced together by journalists and academic investigators long after the event. The documented facts are these. When the white men moved toward the house and tried to force their way through the door, Sylvester Carrier opened fire. He hit what he aimed at. At least 2 men fell dead at the threshold. The historical record identifies them as C.P. Wilkerson and Henry Andrews. The death of 2 white men at the hands of a black man in his own home in rural Florida in January of 1923 crossed a boundary that the existing racial order had no capacity to absorb. The system could accommodate black suffering without disruption. It could process black death as unremarkable. What it could not accommodate was black resistance that drew blood. A black veteran defending his family from his own doorway with lethal accuracy was an event that reordered every priority the mob had carried into those woods. In the gunfire that engulfed the Carrier house that night, Sarah Carrier was killed. She died in the same room where she had gathered her neighbor's children for protection. Sylvester Carrier was killed as well. Surviving accounts differ on whether he fell during the siege that evening or was found and killed the following morning. What no account disputes is the consequence of what he did. Before the Carrier house, the violence had been terrible but contained. 1 man seized, taken to the woods, murdered. After the Carrier house, the violence became architectural. The mob no longer wanted a fugitive. It wanted the town itself to cease to exist. Word of the dead white men reached surrounding communities within hours. By the morning of January 5th, more men were arriving from every direction. They were arriving with kerosene. The systematic destruction of Rosewood began on the morning of January 5th, 1923, and continued without interruption through January 7th. The mob worked through the town with the deliberate pace of men performing a task they believed was necessary. They started with the churches, both of them, the African Methodist Episcopal and the Baptist. the buildings their congregations had framed and raised by hand from locally cut lumber over months of Saturday labor. Then the Masonic Lodge, then the school, then the homes, one by one, moving along the single road that connected them, pouring kerosene across porches and door frames and setting each structure alight before walking to the next. The residents who had not already escaped hid in the swamps to the west. They waded into the cypress stands and crouched in standing water among the roots and the sawgrass, listening to the sound of their own homes collapsing into flame a quarter-mile through the trees. Mothers pressed their hands over the mouths of infants to keep them from crying out. The temperature in Levy County in early January drops into the 40s at night, and families stayed waist-deep in swamp water for hours, some through the entire night, while the glow of the burning town lit the underside of the tree canopy from below. Survivors who testified decades later described the mob firing into the tree line at random, shooting at sound or motion in the underbrush. The exact number of people killed during the week of violence has never been established with certainty. The official tally recorded at the time listed 6 black residents and 2 white attackers dead. Historians who investigated the event in later decades, interviewing elderly survivors and comparing census records against subsequent population rolls, concluded that the actual black death toll was considerably higher. Published estimates range from 8 to more than 30. The physical result was absolute. By January 7th, every black-owned building in Rosewood had been burned. The 2 churches, the school, the lodge, the homes, the sugarcane press, the turpentine still, all of it reduced to ash. The only structures left standing belonged to John Wright, the white storekeeper, whose property the mob chose to leave untouched. A community assembled across more than 4 decades was erased from the landscape in 72 hours. The cedar trees still stood in the surrounding woods. The road still ran through the clearing. The railroad tracks still crossed it. But every physical marker of black life in Rosewood had been deliberately, methodically removed. The survival of Rosewood's women and children is owed in significant part to 2 white men and a locomotive. John and William Bryce were train conductors on the Seaboard Airline Railroad, which ran through both Sumner and Rosewood on its route between Cedar Key and Gainesville. As the violence escalated in the days following the siege at the Carrier House, the Bryce brothers made a decision that placed them at considerable personal risk from the same men who were burning the town. They slowed their train as it passed through Rosewood, and black women and children emerged from the tree cover along the tracks and climbed aboard. The evacuations took place over multiple runs between January 5th and 7th. The passengers were carried to Gainesville, to Archer, and to other stops along the line, where they were taken in by black churches and families willing to shelter people they had never met. The men of Rosewood, in many cases, stayed behind. Some were deep in the swamps. Some had already been killed. Some refused to leave until their families were safely on a train heading away from Levy County. John Wright, the white storekeeper whose home the mob had spared, also sheltered black families inside his house during the worst of the violence. A small number of other white residents in the surrounding area quietly helped individual families escape, though most of these acts went unrecorded and were never acknowledged in public. But individual decisions to act could not substitute for the institutions whose purpose was to prevent exactly what was happening. The Levy County Sheriff's Department did not intervene. Governor Cary Hardy in Tallahassee offered to deploy the state militia. Sheriff Walker reportedly told the governor the situation was under control. By the time anyone with the authority to act acknowledged that a town had been destroyed, there was no town left to save. In February of 1923, a special grand jury convened in Levy County to investigate the events at Rosewood. The jurors heard testimony from white residents of Sumner and the surrounding towns. They heard from sheriff's deputies. They did not call a single black witness. Not one survivor of the destruction was asked to give testimony. The grand jury returned its finding in a single sentence. There was insufficient evidence to issue any indictments. No one was arrested. No one was charged. No person was brought to trial. The men who killed Sam Carter were known to their neighbors by name. The men who set fire to the churches and the homes had done so in daylight, without concealment, in full view of other residents. The grand jury did not conclude that the violence had not occurred, or that the men responsible could not be identified. It concluded, in effect, that the destruction of an entire black settlement by a white mob was not a matter the legal system needed to address. The consequence reached far beyond the courtroom. The grand jury's finding gave the people of Levy County official permission to treat the annihilation of Rosewood as if it had not happened. There was no trial to generate a public record. There were no convictions to be documented in newspapers. There was no state document that said, in plain language, that a town had existed and then been deliberately eliminated. Without a legal trace, the story of Rosewood had no anchor in the public memory of Florida. It fell out of the record the way a stone falls into water. Within a few years, people in the surrounding towns stopped mentioning Rosewood. Within a generation, most had stopped remembering it had ever been there at all. The survivors scattered. Some went to Gainesville, some went to Jacksonville, some made their way to Lacouche, a sawmill town east of Tampa where the Cummer Company ran another mill, and where a man could find work without being asked what he had left behind. Some left Florida altogether and did not come back. What nearly all of them carried, regardless of where they settled, was silence. The survivors of Rosewood did not tell their children what had happened. They did not discuss it with neighbors, co-workers, friends, or anyone outside the shrinking circle of people who had been there. Some families changed their names. Women who had crouched in swamp water while their homes burned raised sons and daughters who grew up with no knowledge that their mother had once lived in a town called Rosewood. The silence was not a failure of memory. It was a strategy for remaining alive. To speak about Rosewood was to identify yourself as someone a white mob had driven from your home. And in the Florida of the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, that identification was not a claim to justice. It was a vulnerability. The physical site vanished from maps. The Seaboard Airline Railroad continued to pass through the clearing where Rosewood had stood, but the stop was removed from the schedule. The road still ran through the pines, but it led to nothing a passing motorist would recognize as a place where anyone had lived. The cedar trees grew back over the old foundations. The forest reclaimed what had been cleared. For more than half a century, the destruction of Rosewood existed only in the private memories of the people who had survived it. And they were aging. By the early 1980s, the youngest survivors were in their 60s. The oldest were past 80. They had held the story in silence for their entire adult lives, and the distance between living memory and permanent erasure was now measured in years, not decades. In 1982, a journalist named Gary Moore, working for the St. Petersburg Times, began pursuing a story he had heard about a black town in Levy County that had been burned to the ground by a white mob in the winter of 1923. Moore spent years locating survivors. He found them in nursing homes and modest houses across the state, elderly men and women who had been children when the mob arrived in Rosewood. Slowly, cautiously, after lifetimes of enforced silence, they began to speak. The testimonies that emerged were consistent to a degree that startled the investigators who heard them. Survivors separated by 60 years and scattered across multiple states described the same events in the same sequence with the same names. They named Sam Carter. They named Sarah Carrier. They named Sylvester. They named Fannie Taylor. They described the baying of the bloodhounds and the sound of kerosene catching on dry pine. They described the weight of cold swamp water around their legs and the orange glow that turned the cypress canopy into a low ceiling of firelight. Each account independently confirmed the others. Moore's reporting brought the destruction of Rosewood into public view for the first time since a handful of dismissive wire reports appeared in Florida newspapers in January of 1923. Other journalists followed. Academic researchers began their own investigations. In 1993, a team of historians and legal scholars at the University of Florida conducted a formal inquiry at the request of the state legislature. Their report documented the events of that week in close detail and reached a conclusion: the grand jury of 1923 had declined to state. The citizens of Rosewood had been attacked, dispossessed, and driven from their homes, and the state of Florida had failed in its most basic obligation to protect them. In 1994, the Florida legislature did something no American state had done before. It passed the Rosewood Compensation Act. 9 living survivors, all of them elderly, each received $150,000. A scholarship fund was established for descendants of Rosewood families. The total appropriation was $2.1 million. It was the first time a state legislature in the United States had voted to compensate black citizens for an act of racial violence. The dollar figure was modest measured against what had been lost, but the act itself was not modest. It acknowledged, in the binding language of statute, what the grand jury had refused to say: that a black community had been deliberately destroyed, that the destruction was driven by racial hatred, and that the government charged with protecting those citizens had chosen to do nothing while it happened. Not one of the men who burned Rosewood was ever charged with a crime. By 1994, all of them were dead. Today, the site where Rosewood stood is 9 miles east of Cedar Key along State Road 24. There is a historical marker. It was placed by the state of Florida in 2004, 81 years after the town was burned. The sign stands on the shoulder of a 2-lane road that cuts through pine flatwoods and palmetto scrub. Behind it, there is nothing to see. No foundations visible above the soil, no cemetery, no remaining structure of any kind. The land has returned to what it was before anyone cleared it: cedar and pine and sand and silence. The Seaboard Airline Railroad tracks that once ran through Rosewood are gone. The line was abandoned decades ago. The old roadbed is still faintly visible in places, a slightly raised strip of packed earth running through the trees, but it carries nothing and leads nowhere. Once a year, the descendants of Rosewood families gather near the site. They come from across Florida and from other states, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who waded into a cypress swamp on a January night in 1923 and never returned to the homes they left behind. They stand at the edge of a clearing in the flatwoods where a town used to be, and they say the name out loud: